Welcome back to the library, and before you get lost amongst the stacks of books, I wanted to remind you that this is technically a second part of a two-part series. This can be listened to independently as we are discussing the life and inspiration for the other works of Dale Carnegie in the previous one, formerly Carnegie. Please go back and listen to that part if you'd like, though it's totally not necessary. In this episode, you're going to discuss and dissect the pivotal work in the self-care genre. A book that has been sold over 30 million times and launched an industry that I am sure many people of a certain profession have taken courses that have been either directly or indirectly influenced by, and briefly touch upon the people who this book influenced. This book is called How to Win Friends and Influence People. Welcome back, Mr. Vernacular Spectacular himself.
Oh, it's good to be back.
Davis Peck. How are you doing, Davis?
Same as it ever was. It's another one.
It's another
one.
Another cold day up here, that's for sure.
At least the sun was out.
At least the sun was out, yeah. It makes everything a lot better. Now, this is going to be a script that walks a fine line of discussion and quoting this book, as I can imagine that the people of the Carnegie Institute are very litigious, and I'm not sure if this book is in the public domain yet. However, we can review and critique something as long as we are fair somewhat, or something like that, if I'm not mistaken.
Fair use, as long as we are using it to make our own product and not repackaging the original.
Yeah, and that being said, I have no intention of reading the book out towards you. So before we get into some of the context of this book, or the content of the book, I want to chat a little bit more about the structure. The main core of the book is organized into 4 parts, where you can learn 3 main lessons or topics that are split into chapters that are what I best describe as small tips, suggestions, or sub-lessons that will help you achieve things like making people like you or being a leader. There's also a preface by his daughter, Donna Dale Carnegie again, where I got a lot of info about her father, Dale Carnegie, and why the book was written. We'll touch about this subject further on for sure. The number of lessons, chapters, whatever you have under each section increase while the number of pages per chapter decreases, and the inverse relationship, if you will, I think is intentional. I think this is organized like this to keep the reader going and motivated, as there aren't a whole lot of more substance in each chapter, or per chapter, let's say. Rather, there are a lot of stories that teach the lesson, and after a while, the stories tend to be a little redundant. It falls on the same characters over and over again, and frankly, once you start reading it and you realize, oh, he's saying that one more time, I don't really think that's captivating.
Now, was this a intentional decision for the benefit of the reader, or was he just getting on that Dickinson contract, getting paid by the word?
I don't think he was paid by the word. I think, they definitely had to fill out the book at one point, but I think it's more intentional by the editor saying, hey, I can't get through this. This is just, at the end of the day, redundant.
Uh-huh.
There are also 2 introductory segments written by Dale. One of this is called How This Book Was Written and Why, and 9 suggestions on how to get the most out of this book. Both titles are very modern in their approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
Almost every title, whether it's a section or a chapter in this book, feels so similar to the kind of clickbait articles you see today. For example, one chapter is called, If You Don't Do This, You Are Headed for Trouble. Or the title of the second section is called 6 Ways to Get People to Like You. It shows, to me, that he was pretty good at getting people's attention, and he may have been one of the pioneers of the listicle itself. I will get into both of these as they are right in the beginning, and will tell you exactly what you need to expect out of this book.
Uh-huh. Well, there's nothing new under the sun, is there?
No, there isn't. Lastly, he got his appendix removed. Rather, he removed the introduction for the first book and made it his appendix, replacing it. This was done by somebody who attended one of Dale's courses, Lowell Thomas, the journalist who covered Lawrence of Arabia and helped pioneer photojournalism as a practice. Yes, if you listen to the first part of this 2-part series, you now know how the sausage is made, if you will. For this case, it's this tasty, yummy kielbasa.
So we were only a couple years away from this potentially being the world's first picture book?
I mean, the picture books have been around forever.
Nah, I don't get your illuminated manuscripts out of here. I'm talking about an honest-to-God picture book.
I mean, it depends on what you mean by picture book. Some of the earliest works of art were picture books that teach women what pregnancy was like.
That's not a book. That's a doll.
Sure. So now let's get into the the book itself, dive into who was it written for, how it was written, and why this book was written, and how to get the most out of it. From the beginning, what you'll see Dale do is very similar to what a lot of people do nowadays to push a product, thought, or ideology onto you. And that is to use a study from a large company stating the importance of the product, thought, or ideology that is referenced by a third party, independently paid for.
Nice.
Here's the quote here. It is true if you are a homemaker, architect, or engineer. Research done a few years ago under the auspices of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, no relation, uncovered a most important and significant fact, a fact later known by additional studies made by the Carnegie Institute of Technology, again, no relation. These investigations revealed that even in such technical lines as engineering, about 15% of one's financial success is due to one's technical knowledge, and about 85% is due to skill in human engineering, to personality, and the ability to lead people.
Wow, Billy Mays really managed to get his elevator speech cut down in the 70-odd interceding years.
Yeah, I'm also, as somebody who had to take stats like for a while and like did research for that reason, like I'm just curious as how they cut that down by like a sixth of what you need to do is actually what you're skilled at, and the rest is just people skills. That's kind of a bold statement. Remember what Dale Carnegie, the complete relation this time, is trying to sell, for lack of a better word, is to improve your confidence and social skills. This book is a self-help guidebook that will help you win friends and influence people. The Carnegie Foundation and the Carnegie Institute of Technology, all jokes aside, it was funded by Andrew Carnegie, somebody who did advance through hard work and got promoted and made almost all of his money by investing early in railroads and then buying steel companies and then raw materials and shipping related to steel through a process called vertical integration, while buying out and absorbing all of its competitors through a process called horizontal integration. This is AKA'd as monopolization. Very little of that success came from human engineering.
Oh, engineering a market.
Yeah, I'm sure there was a few backhanded deals here and there, and I'm sure Andrew Carnegie ended up being a personable guy in some way. But I also heard, and we'll touch upon this, but I don't think anything about that means that he didn't do some shady shit. As stated in the last episode, the first publication occurred right in the heart of the Great Depression. This was a time of serious economic trouble all across the world. People were looking for something, anything to get them back on track for their own financial stability. I believe that this quote from Lowell Thomas truly exemplifies the type of people who were coming to see Dale Carnegie speak and why this book and such human impact on them was huge. Quote, "It was a cold January night in 1935, but the weather couldn't keep them away. 2,500 men and women thronged into the grand ballroom of the Hotel Pennsylvania in New York. The spacious balcony was also jammed. Even standing space was at a premium, and hundreds of people had been lured there by a newspaper ad. 2 evenings previously, they had seen this full-page announcement in the New York Sun staring them in the face. Learn to speak effectively. Prepare for leadership. Old stuff? Question mark? Yes."
Wait, which paper did Carl write for? Was there any chance that
Karl Marx?
Yeah. No, he wrote for a New York paper. I forget what it was. It's not the Times. It's not the Post.
Well, wasn't the Sun the Pulitzer paper?
I dinna ken.
I mean, it's either Pulitzer or the other guy. Not.
Yeah, I would have assumed Pulitzer was a Hertz guy, but let's see what the.
Well, they split at one point. While you look this, I'm going to finish this quote. Old stuff? Question mark? Yes, but believe it or not, in this most sophisticated town on Earth, during a depression with 20% of the population on relief, 2,500 people had left their homes and hustled to the hotel in response to the ad. The people who responded were of upper economic strata, executives, employers, professionals. These men and women had come to hear the opening gun of an ultra-modern, ultra-practical course in effective speaking and influencing men in business. The quote then continues, "The fact that these people, 10 or 20 years after leaving grade school, high school, or even college, came to this training is a glaring commentary on the shocking deficiency of our educational system. It also revealed that they want to learn the technique of getting along with and influencing other people. Looking around for a textbook, they discovered that no working manual had ever been written to help people solve their daily problems in human relationships. And to end this quote further on, a few years in the rough and tumble of business and professional life had brought sharp disillusionment. They had seen that some of the most important men of business successes won by men who possessed, in addition to their knowledge, the ability to talk well, to win people to their way of thinking, and to sell themselves their ideas.
So his target audience was more like an executive certificate program than a pick yourself up by your bootstraps sort of convention, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, so, and we'll talk a little bit more exactly who it is, but I mean, remember, this is the Depression, and people had to pay to see him go there. So it's only people with money that, or like some sort of spending cash, who want to get ahead that'll go see him. From that lengthy passage, a couple of things strike me right away. First, Dale Carnegie was great at marketing. Simply put, taking out full-page ads that only has 2 blunt statements on what to expect is pretty smart. Granted, I'm sure his reputation preceded him a lot of the times, but given what we know about his history with being a top salesman in his company and changing his name, his marketing skills is probably the key component of his book's success. In short, I believe that what this book is truly about is Dale Carnegie trying to teach people on how to market and sell themselves the same way he markets himself at times. It's not the only thing. I think it's actually just part of it, but it's an underlying theme. The second point is, again, touching upon the Depression. The clientele were still people of some means. Probably not the wealthiest elites, though I am sure some of them, some of the truly wealthy did attend some of his courses, but people who came from the stratus of some wealth, living through a difficult time, trying to ascend into a higher social status, which is something I completely and totally unfamiliar with as being a late millennial. I never lived during any time of economic struggle, nor do people ever try to buy books that rhyme with something like bitch, rad, sore, chad that promise economic success by making simple steps.
Fair enough.
Again, the quote shows how ultra-modern it was for this speech and book to come 90 years ago. Even the presentations feel modern in the way that they were structured. Carnegie would basically have real-life user stories or testimonies on how the program benefited their lives. During the presentation, he invited people to speak, and here's a description of some of the speakers, who they were, and why they came. Quote, "The speakers were a cross-section of life, several sales representatives, a chain store executive, a baker, the president of a trade association, 2 bankers, an insurance agent, an accountant, a dentist, an architect, a druggist, who had come from Indianapolis to New York to take the course, a lawyer who had come all the way from Havana." End quote. Notably, none of these jobs are low-paying jobs, say maybe for the baker, but I'm assuming this baker, which I think is a fair assumption really, might have owned his own business or their own business because they had time enough to make a speech.
So it sounds like he was either concurrent with or trying to ride the rise of the petty bourgeois.
Yeah, at the time of the United States, sure. I mean, even the wealthy people during the Depression, some of them had nothing at one point. So it's interesting. Lastly, Dale also addresses people who don't find this book compelling, are too cynical, or don't get anything out of this book directly, like us. Again, I find this statement to be modern at its core. There is something subtle going on here and goes back to how marketing works in this present day. Quote, "If you by the time you have finished reading the first 3 chapters of this book, if you aren't then a little better equipped to meet life's situations, then I shall consider this book to be a total failure as far as you are concerned. For the great aim of education," said Herbert Spence, the English sociologist and philosopher, "is not knowledge but action. And this book is an action book." End quote.
Why should I change? You're the one who sucks.
I know, right? It is very modern in that way, isn't it? It's basically, so as I said, what he's doing here, even before getting into the core of the text, which is right in the introduction. If you don't get or understand what's going on in this book, it's not his failure, but my failure that I cannot get anything out of it. You know what you see there?
Mm-hmm.
You are not smart enough to take these lessons found in this book and put them into action, into real life. The modern word for this is negging. He's negging his audience. And many people will continue to read just to prove they are, in fact, smart enough to get the lessons, which honestly does not really require that much critical thinking. We will only go over a few of these lessons, but it is just the case that he just happens to be the first person to write these down in one compelling book or compact book, and is very modern in the way that he did it.
So was he a bit of a pickup artist then?
I mean, he was a great salesperson. That's
tomato, potato, I guess.
So one major thing that the author does before getting into the actual topics and suggestions is he wants to go over and explains how you should perceive this book. I actually find this quite genius, again, in the purely marketing and sales advocacy realm. He's not able to claim after writing this part that he provided a set of instructions. If you don't follow them closely, it's no longer his fault if you don't get the book, right? Now, the listener of this podcast may think that I'm being cynical, and sure I am, but you should question certain parts of life, and after this specific section, I think you will understand why I chose this specific book to discuss regarding all self-help books in general. I do not plan on delving into many self-help books in this podcast, as I don't really enjoy reading them. This, however, was an exception because it was an exception. I did enjoy reading this at times. There were good stories in there, and they were compelling, and you'll understand shortly why. Therefore, let's dive into the requirements of actually how to read this book. And the first one is, quote, a deep, driving desire to learn, a vigorous determination to increase your ability to deal with people, end quote. Again, I think, candidly, this seems benign, and it probably is, but I find this to be the very core of this genre. And in that statement, Dale Carnegie has officially outlined self-help books.
So was he the first look at me guy?
I wouldn't say look at me. I think he's the first person to bolster a certain class of people who want to understand how to feel better about themselves, if you will. He also says this in this first passage, which will be used in the rest of all self-help books. Quote, picture to yourself how their mastery will aid you in leading a richer, happier, and more fulfilling life. Say to yourself, my popularity, my happiness, and my sense of worth depend on no small extent upon my skill in dealing with people. End quote.
I mean, that's a kind of a no-brainer.
Sure, but that repeating, saying to yourself, that kind of stuff, starting to click, right?
Mm-hmm.
This may not be the first time anyone has ever done or said anything like this to the public, but this was a revolutionary concept at the time. 30 million copies later could prove that. Again, at the risk of being too cynical, this is something we all see constantly in every part of the social media sphere today. But imagine a time where that kind of noise didn't exist. Imagine a time when you had to look for an answer to help solve your problems rather than a time where you are given answers to problems on your phone that never existed in the first place. Some food for thought there. Mm. He also encourages engagement. The fourth point that he points out, as I refuse to go over every single one, the fourth one I think is important, is to, quote, read and highlight with a pencil, pen, or marker in your hand when you come across a suggestion that you feel you could use, draw a line beside it, end quote.
Hey, guys, I just invented this brand new thing. It's called taking notes.
I know, right? I mean, but it's like the engagement is important. Just to break this passage up, this is exactly what I did when I was writing the script, right? I needed to do that. Furthermore, he states, quote, if it is a 4-star suggestion, then underscore every sentence or highlight it or mark it with 4 stars. Marking it and underscoring it, or marking and underscoring a book makes it more interesting and far easier to review rapidly later on.
Make sure when you have your highlighter to highlight the whole thing.
It was so hard not to highlight so much of this because there were so many things I wanted to pull out of it. I mean, we're 20 minutes in, and I think it's going to be obvious why I had to stop when I did. I think this is also the true brilliance of this book. The fact that it tells you how to review it and how to underscore the main points. I also think this is revolutionary. I don't know of any other book that does it this concisely or thoughtfully, really. I know it seems simple, and all of these points are going to seem simple. Read this book intently, and if you do, you'll gain something, is what he's saying. It just doesn't have the same ring as mark the passages as you go along, and maybe you'll go over it again, right? Lastly, I will point out something I found kind of toxic, which is point 7 on the 9 suggestions on how to read this book, which is, quote, offer your spouse, your child, and some business associate $1 every time you catch yourself violating a certain principle. Make a lively game out of mastering these rules, end quote.
You can't manifest the solution until you manifest the problem.
He effectively made the swear jar, right? There's so much going on here. First off, making a game out of this book seems to me like it would kind of cheapen it, but it really doesn't. And it goes back to the last point that I made, where engagement is what this book is all about, and that the more engagement means more sales. Which leads to my next point. If you are making a game out of it, then that means you have to teach your spouse, your child, or your business associate about this book and teach the principles of this book, or at least one or two, which means either you have to be a somewhat coherent, maybe even an eloquent teacher, or they read the book and take it from you. It's a win-win regarding the Dale component, right? Mm-hmm. You spread the book's message one way or another.
Yeah. It's an easier way to sell more than one copy to one family.
All that pocket sand's coming out of nowhere, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I couldn't ever not think of his voice sometimes when I'm reading this book, and maybe there were some exterminators taking his classes or something like that.
Now, Hank, you didn't really give me good eye contact.
Oh man, I wonder if John Redcorn read the book.
Well, I mean, how else did he get Nancy?
So what are the core components of the book? What can you learn from it? Honestly, you've already learned quite a lot. And if you want to know the whole thing, it isn't hard to read. Even though one thing I skipped in the 9 components of reading this book is that it teaches you to reread each chapter at least twice before going on. Don't have to do that. You'll be familiar with the lessons as you go along. As I mentioned in the last episode, all right, sorry, I'm going to go back to that one because I didn't write this out, but I'm just thinking of this now. Think about another toxic element of how you have to reread it once or twice. It means that you're basically treating this book as almost a religious book, yeah. Right? You want to
treating it as gospel,
like gospel, right? Or you're treating it as a textbook either way. But we're dealing with the 1930s and people who are probably religious. That's the same kind of studying, right? You want to memorize it like you memorize the gospel. So, as I mentioned in the last episode, Dale said that he essentially took his lectures and compiled them into this book. I imagine that the most difficult part was actually filling up the book with pertinent information, period. I think this is especially important when reading it now, more so as we go over some of the author's true skill of influencing people. So, not to break too much copyright, and not to give too much away of a book, even if there is no real plot to it, really. Let's go over what is going on.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. You'll see that there are no spoilers. Like I mentioned previously, there are 4 main components, or four main sections. And these are, again, pretty modern titles. The first one is Fundamental Techniques in Handling People. The second is 6 Ways to Make People to Like You. The third, how to win people to your way of thinking. And the fourth and last is be a leader, how to change people without giving offense or arousing resentment. I mean,
those sound pretty useful.
They are all useful. And I mean, I don't think Oprah magazine's that around anymore, but think about, I don't know, I would say Vanity Fair. I don't know any magazines that are like this, but yeah, Town and Country or something like that. I don't think that would be there, but I'm just you just found my extent of middle-aged women magazines right all at once. There you go. Life. Maybe Life. That's not just middle-aged. Again, every one of these titles is super modern. You can feel these titles in any business workshop you are going to be in today. I would love for the listeners from here on end to really think critically about the workshops they have taken before, otherwise known as professional development opportunities. How much of these lessons have you heard before? How many times have you heard about them? And yes, how many of you understand that I'm following the same formula as putting the book together right now? Moving on. I won't go into a huge deep dives of each section. I actually don't think that there's any use to it. So I could go in either approve or debunk each lesson in each chapter, because I just think that's exhausting and there's really no point in doing that. I don't think it comes as a surprise to you that you will win friends and influence people if you stroke somebody's ego by agreeing with what they say, or if you admit you are wrong adamantly, even if you don't think you are, or even you know you're not, and if cooperation by letting the other person feel that their idea or your idea is actually theirs. Today, this isn't groundbreaking, but I generally do believe that it was back then in the day, at least all compiled in one place. So it's up to you to read this book if you want to, and gain something out of it if you wanted to. Again, going back to Dale's statement.
If you're smart enough.
If you're smart enough. So instead, let's go over Dale's writing style, because I think this is actually fascinating, and go over some of the things that I found specifically interesting. Dale Carnegie loves an anecdote. I mean, he really fucking loves an anecdote. With a capital A. Every section, every paragraph, other than when you learn specifically what the lesson is filled with anecdotes to support the lesson.
Now, are these all his stories, or is he passing off other people's experiences as his own?
It's a good question. Who knows?
Who knows?
These can be menial anecdotes filled with people who he met, and they learned a lesson through an uncorroborated source. This happens in every single chapter, every single page. However, Carnegie is a little too canny to start off with this kind of lesson learned section. He is, again, smart guy, and he understood the power of celebrity. So in every single chapter, you will find some kind of massive celebrity within it. But not just any celebrity. These were the most important, most influential, consistently pop-cultured celebrities, period. This almost always includes somebody that the populace considers good, and then another one that the populace considers evil. Right now, I will add that in the beginning chapters, there are far more examples of this again, and then towards the end, you get more tired of reading these anecdotes. I think either the editors or Dale himself understood that you have to keep people engaged, and therefore keep these anecdotes heavy in the front and get the lessons, quote-unquote lessons, again, at the point of the back of the book. Editors are going to be editors, and they're going to fill a book after all, or remove stuff from it.
So it sounds an awful lot like MTV's I Heart the 70s. You got your cultural heroes and your cultural villains all saying the same thing.
I mean, it's not that far off. It's a good example. I forgot that show existed. Yeah, I thought it was VH1, but...
Tomato, potato.
Yeah, I guess so. Who were these celebrities in the 1930s?
Fatty Arbuckle.
Well, the first chapter gives you all you need to know. In the very first chapter of this section, he goes into Francis Two Gun Crowley, a cop killer, as he explicitly states, and somehow someone who undeniably at a young age regarded himself as above the law and was killed by the state via electric chair at the age of 20. Well, he somehow compares this person to Al Capone, somebody who did far more harm and was public enemy number one, and states that both of them don't blame themselves for anything they did. Quoting from the book itself, quote, "Criticism is futile because it puts people on the defensive and usually makes them strive and to justify themselves. Criticism is dangerous because it wounds a person's precious pride, hurts their sense of importance, and arouses resentment." End quote. The rest of the chapter, he continues to put the practice into play regarding Americans that people regard as good. Quoting the book again, quote, "Take, for example, between Theodore Roosevelt and President William Howard Taft. A quarrel that split the Republican Party, put Woodrow Wilson in the White House, and wrote bold, luminous lines across the First World War, and altered the flow of history. Let's review the facts quickly. When Roosevelt stepped out of the office in 1908, he supported Taft, who was elected president. Then Roosevelt went off to Africa. When he returned, he exploded. He denounced Taft for his conservatism, tried to secure the nomination himself for a third term, formed the Bull Moose Party, and all but demolished the GOP, which I think we would have all been better off if he did. In the election, he only carried 2 states, Vermont and Utah. Go Vermont. I don't know how we got associated with Utah there, but I guess our deep connection between Mormonism should probably always associate us between those two.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Never forget.
Never forget. Never forget that both Brigham Young and Joseph Smith are good old Vermont country boys. It was the most disastrous defeat the party has ever known. Roosevelt blamed Taft, but did Taft blame himself? Of course not. Who is to blame, Roosevelt or Taft? Frankly, I don't know and I don't care.
That tub.
Mama, I'm stuck in the bathtub again. The point I'm trying to make is that all of Roosevelt's criticism didn't persuade Taft that he did wrong. It merely made Taft strive to justify and to reiterate. So there's a lot to decompress here. First, let's start with the fact that he's comparing the presidents of the U.S. of A. to literal psychopaths. Both killers, one more famous than the other. I don't think it's too hard to conceive nowadays, but back in the day, they didn't actually have the concept of psychopath who was a leader in business and presidency like we do now, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, sociopath, but yeah.
Sociopath, right. Psychopath is wrong. You're right. Second, I want to point out that he puts up these famous people about regarding how and when to learn and teach each lesson. Because the further you read, the fewer anecdotes are in each chapter again, and the more straight to the point the lesson is. However, you always follow this kind of pattern where there is some pop culture and interesting, and then pivots hard to something less pop culture and everybody understands, and that is biggest celebrities of the time. And still, to this day, to the presidents. Excuse me, not less pop culture reference, more pop culture. And to that point, there were no bigger celebrities than presidents of that day, and still incredibly famous. Taft, Roosevelt, Wilson, while he was still alive, and the glorious cousin, a.k.a. the handicapped crusader himself. And in this corner, we have the polio ponderer, the wheelchair wanderer, the man who created presidential handicapped parking. Franklin Delano Roosevelt will be a prominent figure throughout this.
Pearl Harbor was an inside job.
That's very brave of you, Davis. You want to repeat that?
Pearl Harbor was an inside job.
Okay. All right. Now we have it on record twice. Isn't it actually? He let Pearl Harbor happen? Wasn't that the theory?
No, the theory is he didn't. He delayed some communication so that the attack would be successful, guaranteeing our entry. However, I would believe it. If we had declared war on Germany, but Germany declared war on us.
All right, I joke aside, because somehow the polio vaccine is not recommended in the current administration, and maybe that's what we need to get back to somebody in the office who actually cared about the American people and vaccines.
Well, are you aware about the precipitous decline in wheelchair manufacturing in this country?
Davis, we all know that the wheelchair manufacturing is doing just fine.
No.
And like the FDR, I'm a big fan of. I know it's easy to punch below the belt with FDR. You know, it's 90 years later, 80 years later, but at least you wouldn't feel it.
Oh, I wouldn't punch below the belt. I'm more likely to hit the chair.
He would have been. I think he would have been great at wheelchair basketball. Don't you? No. Okay.
No.
All right. I get. All right, and enough FDR jokes. This is ridiculous, and this is what he does. You know, he starts the chapter. It's all about gangsters, and you wouldn't have they just won't take blame for their actions. And the lesson learned is, you know, he's comparing, you know, basically the most extremes of the culture. I don't want to get too deep into lessons again. Honestly, I don't think I legally can. One of the things that I picked up from this book is that there are often multiple lessons in each chapter, but he always boils it down to one. I think that somebody who has two brain cells connecting will be able to determine what those multiple lessons are when you read them. I also think and find that this is an important part of the book. For instance, out of context completely, one of the principles you can learn is, quote, begin in a friendly way, unquote. And my note was on the side of it, when I was writing the notes for this chapter, quote, when beginning a conversation, anticipate the conflict beforehand, unquote. This is what I mean when you start delving into it. And like, I took that anticipate the conflict beforehand from one of the classes I took this year. It's the same lesson. What I want to say about the book is that he really, really, really loves his anecdotes again. It's undeniable that Dale Carnegie met and knew a ton of people. Tons. I mean, he's the guy who literally wrote the book on how to make friends with everybody, or at least for them to believe that you are making friends with them. What will strike you in this book is how many anecdotes there are. Other than the core principles, the book is just anecdotes. Again, you may be thinking, well, if it's all anecdotes, wouldn't they finally be constructed into something that is fact? Somehow you can't really prove it when you reread them. It's all his experience. And though this is, again, difficult to believe, one thing really struck me is this example. At one point, he brings up Woodrow Wilson again and how he couldn't let go of an argument, specifically regarding the League of Nations. And that is one of the reasons why he passed away, which is like the stress may have built up for him, but let's be reasonable. Woodrow Wilson didn't die because of the stress of the League of Nations. He had to deal with World War I beforehand, and he was an probably unhealthy throughout most of his later years, and stress from the presidency and being a racist. It's probably pretty stressful.
Oh yeah, Princeton's a hard job too.
I mean, I feel like the mortality rate on Prince's are higher.
Princeton.
Oh, Princeton. Excuse me. You're right. I mean, they have to have all those quotas that they don't allow certain people in, and fulfilling them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Remember, people, before there was any form of equity or equality or anything of that, Ivy League schools in particular, but also many different schools in general, had quotas that only allowed a certain group of people to come into the school. End of story. This is something you get throughout the book. He brings up so many famous people, including the favorites that. His favorite is Abraham Lincoln, by far. I feel like Abraham Lincoln is probably said every single other chapter, every third chapter. And remember, the last time we spoke about him, he wrote a biography about Abraham Lincoln that was wrapped in from a dead black man's skin, allegedly at least, who was stolen from a hospital from Baltimore. The man was lynched, again, allegedly. So it's like he loved Lincoln.
Wait, but if I recall correctly, Lincoln neither won a lot of friends nor influenced that many people.
Oh, I mean, he objectively influenced people. It's definitely not the way that he would have said to influence people, but I think Lincoln objectively influenced people. Yeah. All right. Others, like I said, that are already found in this book that I haven't breached on is Ben Franklin. Also randomly, Confucius, Zoroaster, and Lao Tzu. He's an expert on bringing these people in. And in the present day, who do you know that just completely bastardizes, for the lack of a better term, a theology to make a point? Like literally every right and even left-wing persona on social media does this. To be fair, far more people do it on the right. And some of the crap he says might as well just be straight from some of the most toxic people you know at these days. And I think his writing style is one of the most influential things about him. If anybody asks about this, I just picked this random excerpt here. So he also is good at bringing in anecdotes from non-famous people that helped him, or he helped, excuse me. Here's where you can't do any research or compare notes, as we know that he wrote a historical book about Lincoln, as we said, and you can do the research on Lincoln. There's a lot of context out there, or content, but the people that I don't doubt he actually saw or attended his classes in some way, that they gained some benefits from him, well, that's a different story altogether, isn't it? You don't really know what's going on there. When he does do, and he does do often, is he starts with something that seems to be a non sequitur, something mundane and relatable to the audience. Each chapter is formulaic in this sense. He always has at least one example of a famous person, like I said, everybody should know, and then followed by at least one or two that somebody isn't famous, but successful in their field because they learn the lessons provided in this book. Here's a random example I picked from the book itself. One day when Ben Franklin was a blundering youth, an old Quaker friend told him aside and lashed him with a few stinging words, something along the lines of this: "Ben, you are impossible. Your opinions have a slap in them for everybody who differs from you. They become so offensive nobody cares for them." One of the finest things I know about Ben Franklin is the way he accepted the smarting rebuke. He was big enough and wise enough to realize that it was true, to a sense, that he was headed for failure and social disaster. So he made an about face. He began immediately to change his insolent, opinionated ways.
After 2 failed apprenticeships.
Well, there's no year quote on that. So, I mean, Quaker probably almost in the United States, certainly, right? But that could have been in his young life or when he was much older, right?
Well, it's got to be after he left Boston. It's got to be after he left Boston, so, like, teens, 20s.
Like, who knows if this actually happened, right, too? I mean, there's no way to prove or disprove this conversation. At one point, I thought about going into, like, a ton of these examples, like I said, and, like, starting to just like pick at them for their veracity, but like that's just annoying. That's annoying for me. That's annoying for everybody to listen to. Fuck that. Further on, he brings up somebody that he probably knew. This is a Mr. R.V. Crowley, which sounds like a fake name, but probably was around. He was a lumber salesman for a lumber company out of New York. Quote, Crowley admitted that he had been telling hard-boiled lumber inspectors for years that they were wrong, and he won the arguments too, but it hadn't done him any good. Mr. Crowley saw that his firm was losing thousands of dollars through the arguments he won, so he resolved to change his tactics and abandon the arguments. Unquote. Again, there's no way to prove or disprove this ever happened, unless so because who the hell knows if Mr. R.V. Crowley ever existed. That's not really the point I'm trying to make, though. Rather, I wanted to show the formula. And the lesson learned through this chapter, which is principle number 2 in the section called How to Win People to Your Way of Thinking, is the lesson is show respect for the other person's opinion. Never tell them you're wrong.
Well, you're wrong.
I mean, you're not going to win an argument by saying you're wrong, period. And that's like, it's not a rocket science approach to things. Trying to convince somebody, your point of view. You might not completely convince them at that point, but you're certainly never going to change their mind by telling them that.
So do you think Norman Finkelstein has ever read this book?
No. Maybe. I don't know, actually.
No, he definitely has not.
Oh, okay. At least he wasn't smart enough to take the the lessons that he could have learned from here. Let's leave it as that. Let's take Dale Carnegie's point here. It's saying that he read it, but he wasn't smart enough. Now I wanted to bring this up as a method of bringing up the anecdotes that are difficult to prove ever happening. Is again very modern. It's incredibly modern. This just think about the influencers now, specifically about right-wing media personalities when they go back to their thoughts and ideas. It's very similar to somebody like Schmorden Peterson or somebody of that sort, or Jalix Loans does, just random names that doesn't have any correlation with anybody else, even though you can much more easily disprove them. That's not the point. Disproving them isn't going to be working. Like, nobody likes that. It takes so much more time to disprove something than not. And at that point, they already won their argument from the beginning. I have a few basic questions to answer at this point. Was this book a scam? Did he do it for the grift? And what harm did it do to the country or to the people who actually take self-help health books in general. Legally, and in my opinion, the first two answers are a resounding no. I don't think it was a scam, and I don't think he did it for a grift. The last one, I'm going to have a little bit more of a complex answer. How about you for now? Do you think it was a scam?
No, I don't. I don't think it was a scam. I think it was written in earnest. I mean, he definitely was trying to make a buck, but I don't think he was trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. And I don't even think it was that detrimental to society. Like, all these things are useful skills in navigating society. It's what the people who use those skills to what end makes it good or bad.
I have a very literary reason that you might not think is as straightforward as you think when it comes down to its harm. I don't think, one way or another you're going to have people taking these principles, even if they weren't written by Dale Carnegie himself. They were going to take these principles because they're pretty intuitive, and they're going to use it to grift. That's not the what I think is going to happen. And I'll tell you what I think the harm is, and it's more nuanced than you expect. So first, let's talk about the scam, because in order for it to be a scam, I believe that the person who wrote it and wrote the book and had to lead the courses had to fundamentally believe that what they were doing was not going to benefit anybody in any way other than their own personal gain in some capacity, whether it be financial or political. Sure, he did make money off of it, as you said, Davis, but the Carnegies you see today are still influential in many ways, and not the same line as the Dale Carnegie I'm talking about, the other ones. I actually believe that Dale Carnegie was doing this because, one, he knew he was good at what he did and had to make a living somehow. And second, he thought he was helping people. I mean, genuinely.
And because he genuinely was helping people. Even the people who ended up doing it for ill, he helped them accomplish their goals.
Yep. Second, I went through many of the courses in my professional life that went through so many of these tenets and techniques and teachings. Most recently, I went through one at my current job where now after reading this book, he packaged the same lessons just in a different way. He always, this guy, so one of the lessons that you can learn is to remember everybody's name. It's not a core tenet, but it's something that you learn. And this man, I've never seen anybody go in a room of 50-odd people, shake every single person's hand, and recite their name as a dare. And it was incredible because he even spelled names that were odd, like mine, correctly. Like, just, it's like, you're Phil with an F. Like, wow, okay, that's impressive.
That's a skill.
Yeah, it's just a skill. This was something that was boasted in how to influence and how to win friends and influence people. Something I will never ever be able to do, and never forget how it felt when that individual not only knew my name, knew how to spell it, but knew everybody's name. It's just impressive as fuck. Dale Carnegie states that people love their own name, and after a certain age, if you haven't changed it, I think it's genuinely true. That is a tenet that he says people love the sound of their own name. This person also, this speaker, when he went through the concept of how to listen to people, the vast majority of all self-help books I have ever seen who's been shoveling this, self-help book out. A lot of it is just to participate in active listening and not to be pretending to do so. There's quite a lot of them that I mean, I would say, this is just a thrown out percentage, but like 75 to 90% of all self-help books have this core tenet at one point or another. I would just throw a guess out there. This is actually a difficult trait, one that everybody needs to practice regardless of what they do or want to achieve with their lives. So even if I found most of this book just bullshit genuinely, I don't think you won't learn lessons out of it. Most people get something out of it. I did too.
I just no, we were talking about how this is the first modern self-help book, but I wonder how it lines up to something like, say, The Prince or The Art of War, because both those are some form of self-help books, and they're both have, to us, to our modern eyes, what seem to be intuitive pointers, but at a certain point they must not have been.
You're bringing up. I haven't read The Prince in a while, or I forgot how that book was contextualized and how it was actually formed. But Sun Tzu's Art of War is just a listicle, right? At a certain point, he just says this, and I didn't put it in this book, but at the end of each section is a listicle of all the lessons. So if you really wanted to skip ahead and cheat, all you had to do is read that. And like it's effectively the same thing as that, except he brings in all those anecdotes.
There are anecdotes in those books as well. It's just it's more the target audience and how you present those anecdotes.
So I wrote that one of the biggest concerns I had of this book is that there's only so many lessons you can learn, like about self, how to influence people and win friends. How many ways are there to tell somebody to smile when you are hearing bad news, or not to be confrontational, or not to bring up political opinions that upset everybody or somebody in general? How many ways are there to teach somebody that if you want somebody to like you or think they like you, then make them believe they thought of an idea before you did? The lessons in this book are straightforward, but the practice itself can be very toxic when taken to the wrong person, and there's a fine line. And here is going a little off script. When I was thinking about this earlier, because it was pointed out with some post I read, is the modern wealthy class loves self-help books because they make themselves feel smarter and better when they read it. And I think that is one of the most inherently toxic things about the self-help genre, is because it's so popular nowadays. It's propagated by this class and written a lot by the class that is sold to lower classes for them to, let's say, I don't know, try to be like them as well. This is how you're going to gain wealth and success. And the reason why I think that's toxic is because previous wealthy classes in different eras didn't do this, mainly because they didn't want anybody to share the wealth with. But instead, they were pushing great works of literature because that's what they thought would differentiated them from the rest, right? So you wouldn't have things like Anna Karenina, right? I think that's how you pronounce that. You wouldn't have quite a lot of the English writers that we know today. And what I think about when I think about this toxicity is that the level of literature that could be potentially done or written and is not sold and not as well admired is being substituted by something that could be seen online on people.com magazine or whatever in a listicle. And I think that is a core tenet that I really, when I thought about reading this book, I thought I was wasting my time. It was like I could be doing anything else that would be enriching me in a much more positive way than learning smile. It makes people like you.
Well, I don't know. I mean, yeah, having existed with this work in the zeitgeist for approaching a century, of course we have internalized all these lessons without reading the book. But that doesn't mean that the lessons aren't valid. That doesn't mean that there's not useful information to have.
No, and I don't think that it's the lessons that are the toxic part. I think
it's the opportunity cost. But I don't know if I buy the premise of an opportunity cost for an idea. Like, yeah, you have an opportunity cost for what book I read in this particular instant, but just because you didn't read this book doesn't mean that someone else didn't either, and those ideas aren't entering into the common thought.
Well, it's not only just the idea that is the opportunity cost, but it's the potential of art in the product that could be also there. You know, that's the some of the opportunity costs there. And you know, I mean, the wealthy elites can go fuck themselves for so many different reasons, and this is not by no means the most toxic thing they're doing, but it's just another example of how different our culture is in regards to when you're the people
myth of Horatio Alger's.
Yeah.
But to that end, it's not nearly as detrimental as that, because all these things that he says work. Like, yeah, it might only be 1 in 100, but if that one person managed to parlay his techniques into success, That's a net positive.
I mean, for that person, that doesn't necessarily mean it's net positive for everybody. But, I get, I think we're on a very similar path here, and it's just like, and it is such a theoretical and non-provable, like, I absolutely, I will admit to that, something that really cannot be even, like, understood. Honestly, the wealthy elites don't even write that much anymore, right? Like, you don't have a Lord Byron anymore. You don't have anybody of that sort. I mean, yeah, no Marquis de Sade writing fucking smut about necrophilia and eating shit as a, which will do 120 Days of Sodom, I promise you, or at least talk about Marquis de Sade. I don't really know if I want to stomach his magnum opus. Okay. Yeah, there are a lot of lessons in the book that can be learned by people who are genuinely good people, both in media and in politics too, in a position of power. Not including just also the normies out there. The few they may seem, there are good people in there to gain traction on the ways of thinking, so that we have a society that we all participate in and live in a world that there's a future for everybody that isn't marred by wildfires, floods, and extreme polar vortexes. But that's just overly quixotic of me, which quixotic means already overly optimistic, so doubling down on that.
Is that what quixotic means?
Yeah.
I thought it was I always thought it was more foolhardy, and
the connotation is foolhardy.
Well, it's like tilting at windmills is the textbook definition of quixotic. Don Quixote, like, that's what it is.
Oh, it's from Don Quixote. That makes sense. I didn't know that. All right, but the groundbreaking part of this book is not necessarily the lessons or tips, like I said, to conclude, actually, but that it was brought together into one book that is easily digestible. I read this book really more out of curiosity. Some people will find this book far more important than I do and gain something from it. I personally gained very little out of it, only because I learned these lessons many different times, and I just think it's sometimes difficult to implement these if you're not really sold on it, and I guess I'm too stupid to not get the book. However, I wanted to finish this podcast episode by bringing up people who are directly influenced by this, or at least have said they were, or you could see how they potentially were. Now, it's really not anybody's fault. Again, I'm going to put this down. How one takes the lessons from this book or the art somebody uses and uses it in their own real life. Because if you speak to tens of thousands of people while you're in your lifetime and sell 30 million copies, there are going to be some bad eggs out there, as we discussed. Some good ones right off the bat, or some people that I enjoy. Johnny Cash, for instance, took the Carnegie training and gained a lot out of it, apparently. Though Johnny Cash did have his own problems, I think he was one of America's greatest country artists, period. There's also a photo of Eminem reading the book for more modern people. I guess he's still relevant, definitely, today. He's never said anything of whether he gained anything out of it, but when I looked up people who were influenced by it, there's a photo of him reading it. Frankly, he didn't learn to smile, so
Yeah.
I mean, he did. It's a joke.
You don't have to take everything you read.
Yeah, no, at least he took some of it. Warren Buffett, somebody who claims that the book has changed his life.
I don't believe that. Yeah.
Billionaire shouldn't exist. I think that obscene wealth is either fundamentally immoral or amoral at its absolute best. But the Carnegie Institute actually loves waving his flag around. Lastly, the person who may shock you, who took the training and transformed him, was none other than Charles Manson of the Charles Manson fame.
Now, was that assigned to him by the people at Langley, or did he just pick it up on his own?
He picked it up on his own. This was his first adult prison stint. So this was before the Bianchi murders. He read the book while doing one of the first stints in federal prison, and he claimed that it helped shape his skills in manipulating people. Any other questions?
No, that checks out.
Yeah. And on that curveball, I'm going to end this podcast. Thank you, Mr. Vernacular Spectacular himself.
Not a problem at all. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.